Let's take a breath together. Today we are talking about one of the most challenging topics to talk about. Forgive to live. And I want to say right off the bat that we're talking about forgive as a verb versus forgiveness as a noun because they're very different. Forgiveness is the byproduct of forgive. Because if we don't do forgiveness as a verb, if we don't forgive as a verb, we never get to forgiveness. I also want to acknowledge that this is painful for folks and that some of you have already started an internal argument. And that's okay. Be right where you are. So I want to start with a quote from Krishnamurti. In his 1984 speech to the United Nations, he said this: "How can there be external peace in the world if one is not at peace with oneself? We will never answer that question. We are always trying to bring about change externally. We never seem to realize that unless each of us changes radically, there will be no peace on earth." Let's just take that in for a minute. I want to go over this morning, instead of having questions for you to take with you week, I'm going to give 8 steps to consider this activity of forgive to live. The first is we need to know what it means to give, what it's not, and why it matters. Right? To forgive literally has nothing to do with anybody else's behavior. The dictionary definition of forgive. To forgive is to make a conscious, deliberate decision to release feelings of anger, resentment, and or vengeance toward a person or group who has harmed you, regardless of whether they actually deserve your forgiveness. Now, nowhere in there does it say we forget what happened. Nowhere in there does it say you weren't really harmed, because in this physical realm, we harm one another. We do. Every one of us has caused harm, whether it be intentional or unintentional, to someone. Whether it's through something we said, whether it's through something we did, whether it's in a parking lot at a grocery store when we both backed up together and tried to occupy the same space at the same time with our cars. Okay. It's part of the human journey. It's when we hold on to the feelings, we get ourselves in trouble. To forgive not mean forgetting, nor does it mean condoning or excusing offenses. It also does not mean doesn't give you access to the person who is forgiving. Right? It doesn't mean we set ourselves up for the same event. I can forgive you and still you don't have access to me anymore. That's a challenging thing for a lot of people, especially victims of domestic violence. Okay. Forgiving the perpetrator doesn't mean you give them access to hurt you again. It means you let go of the anger and resentment that ties you to them, is what it actually means. Why does it matter? Because the act of practicing this thing called forgive increases our self-esteem. It increases our sense of inner strength and safety. We'll talk more about that in a minute. When we hold on to stuff, we continue to hurt ourselves. The other person doesn't even know, right? They don't know you're holding them in all this anger. They don't know. And it's the one who's being hurt. We are. So that's another reason why it's important to set ourselves free. It's not about the person. I promise you. Science, medical technology has shown that letting go of that anger and resentment decreases depression, decreases anxiety, it decreases unhealthy anger. Did you catch that? Unhealthy anger. Not all anger is unhealthy. Some of it is absolutely appropriate. We have to learn the difference. And we get relief from symptoms of PTSD when we let go of what anchors us to it. Spiritually, and I think this is one of the most challenging things for us in this human experience to grasp, is there's no such thing as forgiveness. There's no such thing. Because forgiveness requires that something be deemed wrong. And what created us with absolute free will under the condition of grace, which means it doesn't see anything wrong. It literally doesn't. Its whole thing is to create in multiplicity, to increase its experience of itself, and grace is that activity where free will really comes. It doesn't withdraw. It doesn't get angry. It's because it's self, right? And the whole concept of forgiveness, this whole act of forgive, is really a human construct that lead us to a more authentic experience of our spirituality when we practice it. Because it takes us back to oneness. It takes us out of separation and back to the truth of who we are. It's not an easy journey at all. Step 2. Much like when we start working out our physical body to become stronger, we need to start working out our Forgive Fit program, right? Because we have to build a forgive muscle. We're not taught how to do this, folks. We're taught guilt, shame, and blame. We're taught reward, punishment, mostly punishment. And so we don't have a very strong forgive muscle. So how do we build a forgive muscle? Especially when we're dealing with folks that hurt us. Well, I suggest you start with people that haven't hurt you. Right? Start with some of the really benign things, like when you're in the grocery store and someone in line is irritable, forgive. Immediately. When you catch yourself having irritable thoughts about that person, interrupt it. Begin to build your forgive muscle. See them as magical. See, even respond kindly. You know, if someone snaps at you, those of us in relationships, we can snap back, or perhaps we can say nothing and just smile at our partner. Perhaps we could offer a hug, but to begin to build our forgive muscle by stop criticizing. Stop finding fault with people who are just having a people moment. Right? It begins to build the muscle. We have to, step 3, we have to address our inner pain. We have to. This is the land where spiritual bypass comes in. Right? And we cannot afford spiritual bypass because it doesn't really deal with anything. To tell yourself when you're in a place of deep pain because you have legitimately been abused. To go to that place of, well, I know I just got the crap beat out of me by my spouse, and here I'm laying in the hospital with all kinds of injuries, but I'm whole, perfect, and complete. It's true, and it's a spiritual bias. I have to own that I'm aching and that I feel broken. I'm angry because I've been physically assaulted and abused. We have to own the feelings. We have to be willing to dance with our shadow side. Do you know that shadows are nothing more than blocked light? That's all they are. A shadow is created by an object that blocks light. And so those places in us that are hurt, that we don't go to, we can't move them out of the way if we don't acknowledge them. We have to go to that place. We have to acknowledge our pain. And we have to love ourselves in our pain in order to get through our pain. The other thing we have to do is recognize that not everything that feels like somebody else wounded us is accurate. Right? Sometimes we take things personal and we wound ourselves with it and blame somebody else. Our woundedness is not always just. Sometimes it's a projection of how we already feel about ourselves. And here's the thing about this anger, resentment, woundedness. There's a triangle. Okay. Every point on the triangle is necessary for it to exist. For there to be a victim, there has to be a villain. Every time there is a victim and a villain, somebody's looking for a hero to solve it. There's the triangle. Right. How do we get off the triangle? We get off of it. Just get off of it. If you find yourself in the point where you're a victim, we address our inner pain. There is a huge difference between acknowledging that we are the victim of something and becoming a victim. One is a factual event that happens in the physical realm. Right? Somebody breaks into your house. You are a victim of a break-in. 10 years later, if you're still telling the story and you're still terrified and you're still angry at whoever broke into your house, you have taken on the identity and practice of being a victim. And you know who your villain is, even if you don't know who broke into your house. Whoever broke into your house is your villain. What you don't have is a savior. You don't have a hero. And if you keep looking one, chances good you're going to remain in the victim role because you put yourself there by consent. And that's a hard for us to swallow sometimes. Because I didn't break my own house. No, you didn't. And the part was real. But when you hold on to the anger, and you hold on to the resentment, you chain yourself to that event and you chain yourself to that victimhood. That we do by consent. And it's only by consent that we get to undo that. So how do we do that? We have to train ourselves by telling ourselves the truth. Right? We go back to we're building our forgive muscle. We practice it. That's why we call this stuff spiritual practice. It's not spiritual arrival. It's not spiritual graduation. Right? Because we're all still here on planet Earth in this tumbler of humanity, bumping into one another, polishing one another, and stuff happens. Stuff happens. And so we start putting these things in practice, and we begin to develop empathy. Interestingly enough, we've got scientific studies that show that even people who imagine forgiving other people in completely hypothetical situations where nothing actually happened lights up the neurocircuits in the brain responsible for empathy. So faking the practice of forgive will help you empathy. I find that exciting and quite remarkable. Right? So you can just make up. Right? To begin to build that empathy. That, well, hypothetically, if this were to happen, I forgive you. Right? And even just saying that now, I felt some energy move in my body. I was like, whoa, that was trippy. Okay. So practice. Make up hypothetical scenarios and begin to activate and build that empathy part of the brain. So that when you need it, it's got some zap in there. It's not the first time you visited empathy. Right? Because sometimes that's what we do. We wait until everything falls apart. And then we're like, uh-oh, now what? If we practice this stuff, if we live this stuff, then it's accessible when we actually need it. I think step 5 is often misunderstood, and we make it harder than it has to be. Step 5 is find meaning in your suffering. Now that is very different than everything happens for a reason. Okay? God was teaching me something. There's no God outside of you that has a textbook and a lesson plan for your life. That is not how it happened. Okay? It's not. We are that come here as and we are in our journey of remembering that. And I call it because it has no gender and it has all genders. It creates and then it leaves its creation to evolve and remember who it is, what it is. Pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional. Pain is going to happen because we interact in relationships. It's just going to happen. When we hold on to it, we create our suffering. Now, there's lots of reasons why we might do that. If I feel completely empowered as a human being, if I feel completely invisible on planet Earth, if I feel like nobody notices me and my suffering creates enough drama and enough energy that it gets your attention, well, now my suffering has tremendous meaning because it validates my presence here on planet Earth in a sick, twisted kind of way, but it does. Here's the problem with that. It also validates the lie that you're inadequate. It validates the lie that you're unseen. It validates the lie that you don't matter. And you do. And so if we lean into what is suffering about? What is it really about? It may be as simple as I don't know how else to do it. It can be that. But if we can find meaning in it, and then the flip side is for those of us that have experienced abuse, authentic, straight out, uncalled for, never going to be okay abuse, what I can tell you as one of those people is that it's one of the greatest gifts I have now. Because it allows me to sit with people, freeing myself from the suffering of it. Didn't take away the experience. It took away the chain to the abuser. And so now I can use it to sit with people in their suffering and demonstrate that there can be freedom if we choose it. It's not easy. I've never experienced it to be fun. But I promise you, on the other side of every ouch is an amazing hallelujah. There, if we will do the work to step into it. It doesn't mean what happened is okay. It just means if we're gonna have a relationship with those events, why not have a powered relationship that helps other people heal, that helps us all come back to an awareness of our wholeness instead of living in resentment and anger that kills us physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually every day. We get to choose. We get to choose. Step 6, when it's hard, when it's too hard to navigate on your own, lean into somebody else's strength. That's why we do community. There are times when it is just too raw to do on your own. That's why we have practitioners. That's why we have ministers. That's why we have each other. That's why we have Walk with the Rev. Because you can come walk for an hour and just be. And if you want to talk, you can talk. And if you don't want to talk, you don't got to talk. But it's a place of refuge. Right? You can reach out to practitioners that will help you remember the truth of you, that will help you sort all this stuff out and guide you back to you. Step 7, you got to forgive self. Because the thing that binds us to the trauma, the thing binds us to events happened years ago, is our agreement with them. Those places where we think we have to be angry in order to be empowered, underneath that is the whole me has no power, right? And it's easy to get there because most of those actions of abuse took away our no. When people exert power over us, it's easy to fall into a belief that I have no power without realizing that we're agreeing with the abuser. So we have to begin to forgive ourselves for not knowing how to do it differently. That's all it is. Nobody teaches this stuff growing up. I live for the day when our kids get this kind of stuff in school. Right? Math is great, but how do I live on planet Earth? Teach me that. Right? Step 8. Develop a spiritual practice of replacing anger and resentment with love. Now, that does not mean you sit around going, I love my abuser, I love my abuser, I love my abuser. It's not what I am. Anger and hate are responses to something we love. They are offensive, protective response to what we love. And so instead of stopping at the anger, the hate, what do you love? What are you protecting? What is so precious to you that you love it? For parents of children that have been abused, they love their children. So shift the focus to, I love my children. My children are valuable to me. I get to stand up with my children. I get to protect my children. Way more productive than spending your time being mad and resentful at your child's abuser. Because what happens in that scenario is your child's left out in the cold. And that's not really what you want to be doing, but that's what happens. Ultimately, we are a choice. And I want to wrap up with this. Many of you may be familiar with this story. It's a little story about the difference between heaven and hell from Ram Dass's book, How Can I Help? A burly, rough samurai approached a monk. The monk was incredibly small and frail. And the samurai used to his presentation in the world is he's used to being heard. And so right out of these, like, hey monk, teach me something about heaven and hell. The monk took a breath, put his head down. Then he looked up at the samurai, and with equal energy, teach you something about heaven or hell? I can't teach you anything. You're dirty, you smell bad, your sword's rusty, you are an absolute disgrace to the lineage of samurai. Get out of my sight, I can't stand you. The samurai was enraged. Absolutely enraged. Speechless enraged. You know that place where you just are so angry you can't even talk. And he lifted his sword, trembling, face red, to execute the monk. And the monk whispered, "That is hell." And it stopped the samurai in his tracks. And he was shocked at what he heard. And he slowly put his sword down as he recognized that this frail monk risked his life to teach him something about heaven and hell. And as he put down his sword, his energy, she shifted gratitude, peace. And the monk whispered, and that is heaven. Let's take this into prayer. So great to recognize that in the active life, it is all one thing unfolding itself. One energy, one love, one power, one presence, one substance, creating out of itself, by itself, to be itself, free of guilt, shame, and blame, free of any need to forgive, because it simply loves itself, its creation. I know being made out of it, by it, to be it, that I am it, individualized into this physical form. And I know that what is true of me is true of all life, each a divine, individualized expression of perfection, never separate from it. And so I speak my word, claiming, affirming that this activity to forgive becomes the nature, becomes the activity that returns us to our divine nature. Each individualized expression on their own path, on their own time schedule, in their own unfolding. No way, no wrong way. Just a way. And that in this path is freedom. As we release everything unlike divine truth of creation, we are set free to live fully, to live freely, to live in celebration. And so I celebrate the perfection of life unfolding itself as each individualized expression. I celebrate grace. I celebrate love. So in this celebration, I release my word knowing it's already done, that each path is ebbing along just perfectly. So I let it go. I let it be. And so it is.